taught that the Soviet Union collapsed because communism failed, that it was inefficient, corrupt, outperformed by capitalism. That story is comforting, because it suggests collapse is loud, obvious, earned, but the Soviet Union didn't collapse when the flag came down. It collapsed years earlier, quietly, when it signed paperwork. No tanks crossed Moscow. No bombs fell on the Kremlin. No army marched in. Instead, the most powerful rival the United States ever faced was financially repositioned. Not conquered, not invaded, but managed. And it began with a decision that looked responsible, measured, temporary. An $18 billion decision borrowed, not lost, that rewired the Soviet system from the inside. This is not a story about ideology. It's a story about denomination, about what happens when a superpower accepts rules it cannot enforce. Because once the debt was issued, the collapse was no longer political, it was procedural, and procedure doesn't care about flags. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet Union looked untouchable. It had nuclear parity with the United States. It controlled half of Europe through force and fear. Its ideology wasn't just political, it was civilizational. The USSR didn't just compete with capitalism, it rejected it. Officially, the Soviet economy was closed, centralized, and sovereign, planned by the state, protected from the chaos of markets. This image mattered, not just to outsiders, but to the system itself, because belief is a form of control, and the belief was simple. The Soviet Union did not need the West. But behind the speeches, behind the parades, behind the missiles rolling through Red Square, something uncomfortable was already true. The Soviet economy was not self-sufficient. It never had been. The USSR could produce tanks, it could produce rockets, it could produce ideology, but it struggled with something far more dangerous to lack: food, technology, hard currency. Grain yields were inconsistent. Industrial equipment lagged behind Western standards. Consumer goods were inferior and scarce. This didn't collapse, it was friction. And friction is manageable if you can hide it. So the Soviet leadership did what all large systems do when pressure builds quietly. They compensated, they imported grain, they imported machinery, they imported expertise, and they paid for it with exports of oil, gas, and raw materials. At first, this looked like strength. The USSR had resources the world needed. But resources only create power if you control the pricing, and that control would not last. By the early 1970s, the global system had changed. The US dollar, no longer backed by gold, became the global settlement currency. Energy prices surged, trade expanded. This was the world the Soviet Union publicly rejected and privately depended on, because international trade does not operate on ideology. It operates on liquidity. To trade at scale, you need dollars, not rubles, not promises, only dollars. And the USSR didn't issue them. This was the contradiction at the heart of the Soviet system. It rejected capitalism, yet required access to its bloodstream. At first, the cost was subtle. A deal here, a shipment there. But systems don't fail from one dependency. They fail when dependency becomes structural. The real pressure arrived quietly, not through war, through weather. In the 1970s, Soviet agriculture faltered. Harvests underperformed. Food shortages became harder to disguise. Queues grew longer. This wasn't just an economic issue. It was political. The Soviet state promised provision, stability, control. Empty shelves weren't just inconvenient. They were humiliating. So the leadership faced a choice: admit vulnerability or buy time. They chose time. The Soviet Union turned to Western markets to import massive quantities of grain. The United States, Canada, and Europe. The scale was unprecedented, and it worked temporarily. Food arrived, shortages eased, and the system stabilized. From the outside, it looked like competence. From the inside, something far more important had happened. The Soviet Union had crossed a line. It had tied domestic stability to external supply. And external supply doesn't operate on trust. It operates on credit. Western banks saw the opportunity immediately, not as conquest, not as sabotage, only as architecture. The Soviet Union wasn't treated like an enemy. It was treated like a client. Loans were extended, credit lines opened, not reckless, not aggressive, responsible. And this is where the story is often misunderstood. The $18 billion wasn't stolen, it wasn't imposed, it wasn't forced, it was only accepted because it solved immediate problems, because it smoothed disruptions, because it allowed the Soviet leadership to avoid political embarrassment, and because it came with a promise: this is manageable. $18 billion sounds large, but for a superpower, it wasn't fatal. What mattered was how the debt was structured. The loans were denominated in US dollars, not rubles, not barter, and not resources, only dollars. This single detail changed everything, because dollar debt does not care about your system. It does not adjust to your ideology. It does not respond to your needs. It demands payment on schedule in a currency you do not control. From this moment forward, the Soviet economy had two masters: the planning committee and the balance sheet, and only one of them enforced consequences. At the time, the decision appeared rational. Oil prices were high, export revenue was strong. The USSR assumed future income would cover present obligations. This is how traps work. They don't look like traps when you enter them. They look like optimization. Borrow now, pay later, and maintain stability. The leadership believed time was on their side, but they were wrong. Because markets do not owe continuity to planners, and planners cannot command prices. Then the world shifted. Oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s, not gradually but violently. The Soviet Union's primary source of hard currency evaporated. Exports still flowed. Infrastructure still functioned. But the dollars stopped coming. The obligations didn't. This is where the trap closed. The Soviet Union now faced a contradiction it could not resolve. To earn dollars, it needed to export more. But increased exports drove prices lower. The harder it worked, the less it earned. Meanwhile, dollar-denominated debt payments remained fixed. No ideology can negotiate with arithmetic. This is the moment when sovereignty quietly dissolves. Not because someone takes it, but because it becomes conditional. Western banks didn't panic. They didn't threaten. They offered solutions. Refinancing, restructuring, and extensions, each one framed as assistance. But every new loan existed for one purpose: to ensure the old one was paid. This is how systems maintain control without force. No ultimatums, no public humiliation, just schedules. From this point forward, Soviet policy wasn't driven by long-term planning. It was driven by payment deadlines. Budgets tightened, domestic investment slowed, not announced as austerity, presented as efficiency. The leadership still spoke of strength, still projected power. But behind closed doors, decisions were no longer strategic. They were reactive, and reaction is not governance. It is a surrender stretched over time. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union had not collapsed. It still had missiles, armies, and allies. But it had lost something more important: freedom of action. Every option now carried a financial penalty. Every reform risked exposure. Every delay risked default. The system was trapped between ideology and obligation. And obligation was winning. The collapse had not begun publicly, but privately on balance sheets, in contracts, in currency terms. It was already irreversible. The door had closed. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was still standing. The flag still flew. The party still ruled. The military still intimidated half the world. From the outside, nothing looked broken. That's the danger of financial collapse. It doesn't announce itself with explosions. It arrives as policy adjustments. There was no declaration of crisis. Instead, there were revisions. Budgets were rebalanced. Projects were reevaluated, and imports were prioritized. These words matter. They're the language of management, not defeat. But underneath them, something fundamental had changed. The Soviet state was no longer allocating resources based on ideology or strategy. It was allocated based on liquidity pressure. Which bill is due first? Which creditor needs reassurance? And which export can still generate dollars? This is not how empires govern. This is how companies approaching insolvency behave. Cuts arrived quietly, not framed as sacrifice, framed as efficiency. Consumer goods became scarcer. Infrastructure degraded, and maintenance was delayed. The people felt it first. Longer queues, empty shelves, and lower expectations. But the state could not admit why. Because the truth wasn't political failure. It was financial exposure. And exposure, once acknowledged, accelerates collapse. So the system denied it, even as it obeyed it. This is where the story is often misunderstood. Perestroika, glasnost. They're remembered as ideological awakenings, as if the Soviet Union suddenly chose openness. But systems don't liberalize out of curiosity. They liberalize under pressure. Reform wasn't a philosophical pivot. It was a liquidity strategy. Perestroika was sold as restructuring. But restructuring only happens when the old structure can no longer carry its load. The Soviet economy was suffocating under obligations it couldn't grow out of. Central planning struggled to respond quickly enough. State enterprises were inefficient. Foreign creditors wanted reassurance. So the system loosened control, not to empower citizens, but to unblock cash flow. Private initiative wasn't freedom. It was outsourcing risk. Glasnost opened information channels. Again, not as a moral breakthrough, but because secrecy had become expensive. Markets distrust opacity. Creditors demand visibility. Transparency lowers risk for lenders, but it raises danger for regimes built on control. Once information moves freely, belief weakens, and belief was the Soviet Union's final stabilizer. Every reform introduced new contradictions. Opening markets increased inequality, transparency exposed corruption, and decentralization weakened authority, but reversing course was impossible because reform had become a condition. Not imposed publicly, but enforced structurally. The USSR wasn't reforming to survive ideologically. It was reforming to remain solvent. Insolvency comes with rules. The leadership believed reform could be calibrated. Open just enough, change just enough, and expose just enough. But systems don't respond to intention. They respond to incentives. Once profit appeared, loyalty eroded. Once information flowed, legitimacy fractured. Once contracts mattered more than commands, authority dissolved. This wasn't chaos, it was unbundling. The Soviet system wasn't being attacked, it was being taken apart, one function at a time. By the late 1980s, the state still existed, but it no longer controlled outcomes. Republics demanded autonomy. Enterprises followed money, not Moscow. Officials protected themselves, not the system. Why? Because the center could no longer guarantee provision, and provision is the foundation of control. Once the state can't deliver it, can't command, the Soviet Union didn't announce bankruptcy. It didn't need to. Its promises simply stopped working. Wages lost meaning, savings evaporated, assets bled value. This is what default looks like, inside an empire. Not a missed payment, but a loss of trust, and trust, once gone, doesn't renegotiate. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in 1991, most people thought the collapse had just happened. It hadn't. The real collapse was already complete. What followed wasn't destruction, it was liquidation. Factories didn't disappear, they changed hands. Infrastructure wasn't bombed, it was repriced. Natural resources didn't vanish, they were absorbed into global markets under new ownership, new rules, and new currency. This is the final stage of financial collapse. There was no last stand, because there was nothing left to defend. The military still existed, but funding collapsed. The party still existed, but authority didn't. The ideology still existed, but belief had drained away. You can't fight a spreadsheet. You can't arrest a balance sheet. You can't threaten a contract into submission. So the Soviet Union didn't fall, it expired. By the end, the original number barely mattered. 18 billion was never meant to be repaid in full. Its purpose was achieved the moment the system became dependent. Debt isn't about extraction, it's about alignment. Once incentives align with external systems, control migrates, quietly, legally, and irreversibly. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because nothing about this was unique to the USSR. Different flag, different ideology, but same structure. The state seeks stability. It accepts external financing. Debt is denominated in a foreign currency. Exports fund repayment. As long as prices hold, everything works. Then markets shift. Revenue falls. Obligations don't. Reforms begin. Sovereignty shrinks. Assets migrate, and no invasion is required. Today, this process is sold differently as a development. But integration into a system you don't control is not a partnership. It's exposure. And exposure always has a price. This matters. The banks weren't evil. The system wasn't malicious. It was efficient. It rewarded compliance, penalized resistance, and absorbed weakness. That's what systems do. They don't need intent, and they need structure. The Soviet Union didn't lose to capitalism. It adopted capitalism's rules, without its protections. It entered a financial architecture where power flows to issuers, not participants, and once inside, there was no exit. We like to believe collapse is dramatic, that we'll see it coming, that there will be a moment where the danger becomes obvious. There won't be. Because modern collapse doesn't look like failure, it looks like management, budget meetings, policy reforms, and responsible decisions, all made under pressure, all accelerating the same outcome. The Soviet Union didn't collapse when it fell behind. It collapsed when it accepted a system that measured it. Because once power is priced, once sovereignty is denominated, once survival depends on external approval, history doesn't end. It repeats, quietly, legally and inevitably.